Hello everyone, today I thought we'd continue with the Ruby on Rails Unreal Engine tutorial we did a couple weeks ago. In that tutorial we set up a system where you had a DigitalOcean droplet that was running the Docker marketplace image from DigitalOcean, and you could press a button in your Unreal Engine project to get some data from the API. So in this case our API was just a list of posts, so we could test like basic getting and retrieving of data. This time I thought we'd take it a little bit further and make it like actually applicable to a game. And we will be creating this player list. Now, if we expand one of these, you can see the player 1 has a X, a Y, and a Z coordinate saved, so you can probably see where this is going. We're going to be storing the player location, and then we're going to be retrieving it later for like a save load type of setup. Now, of course, if you're like doing real-time communication, you might want to do something a bit more efficient than rolling an entire web server to handle it. But you'll probably have some data that you want to pull from a web server, and if you're using Ruby on Rails, well, you might as well use it for this too, right? So the way we're going to do this is we're going to continue off with the part 1 stuff we had set up, which you can go to the link in the video description to watch part 1. And then with the DigitalOcean container or the AWS or whatever you go with, as long as you have like a server that you can connect to, we're going to add a migration for the players. We're then going to change what the scaffold builds for us a little bit, and then we're going to go into the Unreal project. So let's start with the Rails project. We're going to do things a little differently today, and we're going to just look at the code that was generated as opposed to generating it again. So the way that this was generated was with a command that looked something, oops, let's actually go to this tab because it'll look prettier. It was with something similar to this. We did a Rails G scaffold for a player model, and we gave it a X colon decimal, a Y colon decimal, and a Z colon decimal. And that was effectively it. You run this command, you then do a db migrate, and then you're pretty much caught up to where we are in terms of the migrations. Now for the, let me run Rails S again. For the actual code changes, we come in here and we change the show. It starts off as a JSON for @player, I think. And we just return the X, Y, and Z because I'm not really using the updated @ or created @ here. Then for our create, that stays the same, but we create a new action here called save location. This of course requires us to create a route. So in your routes here, if I do Control+ again, we have this post with a save location ID, and it takes us to the player's controller and the save location action. So we have to add the ID to the URL that we're requesting, and then in our player's controller we can call, or we can access the save location. This of course is going to do a player.find or create by, which takes in the ID, and then it tries to find that player. If it can find the player, it then creates it. If it can't find the player, it creates it. If it can find the player, it just returns that player object. And then either way, it's either been found or it's been created. We then call an update on it to do the player params, except the ID. We then render the JSON for the player. You could, of course, do something similar to this render method here. It's just spaghetti code I threw together for a fun little like thought project more than anything else. Down here in our player parameters, the way we're going to be passing this from Unreal, it's actually going to be inside of a data object. So we're going to have like a data object that has, you know, the player inside of it, and then the player is going to have an X colon 5, a Y colon 5, and a Z colon 0, right? So we need to get the data from that, and then we create new params, which will just give us these player params right here. And then from those player params, we require player, and then we permit the X, Y, and Z. So that's kind of what we're doing there. Okay, so that's basically our setup from the Rails perspective. Once you have that done, you can either clone the repo from the previous video or create your own whatever. You then want to commit the code and go over to your remote server, so either your DigitalOcean droplet or whatever your production server is in this case, and then you just want to clone the code or do a git pull. Once you've done your pull, and assuming you have Docker set up on that server, you can then go ahead and run the Docker commands. Now this will be in the README for this code base for this, which is going to be this one. We'll come down to our README, we'll get rid of this, and we'll say this is the Docker run command. So this is going to let you build your app, create your volume, and then do your Docker run. In this case, this is my Rails master key. You are going to want to change this master key. So we might say something like, remember to sub out your master key for mine below. Right, I don't have anything in the master key file, just, you know, whatever comes with the credentials, but that's just, yeah, make sure you do that. Okay, so now that we have this, we've pushed it up, we've come over to our remote, we have this command inside of our terminal. We can then go ahead and run this, it'll build, and then it should hopefully spin up at some point. You can then go over to your IP port 3000/players and just see if you have anything. If you don't, it's fine. We'll try to create it. Okay, so now we have to actually do the VA REST portion from the Unreal project. So for this, we're going to have 2 actions here. The first one's going to be a event that happens when we press the 1 key. This will then call the URL just like we did last time. We use the VA REST subsystem. This is all coming from the plugins VA REST. It's a free plugin on the Unreal Marketplace. You can just download it, go here, enable it. It'll tell you to restart. You restart your Unreal, and then you're good to go. So we do the VA REST. We use a load URL. This goes to our server IP port 3000/players/1, because if we go over here to /players/1, that's the thing that just gives us back our player object. So that's what we're doing there. After we get the URL, we then grab the actor transform and we call make JSON with it, which is from VA REST. We plug in 4 different items here. One is the X coordinate, one is the Y coordinate. These are all set to numbers. And then we have the Z coordinate, and then we have a player, which is a string that I don't quite recall if I'm using that for anything. But yeah, so we pass that back into this call URL. This then gives us a callback, which is going to be the thing that actually handles the loading of your location. Now in here, you have a couple different options for how you want to do this. I'm going to move this down here actually. So what we do is we say, all right, we want to get the response content as a string. We then log this string. And then we don't really use it, because what we actually do is we pull off of here and we call a get response object, which allows us to break a JSON. And then from in here, we can again add some items that are our output. And we just make sure these match what we expect to get. In this case, we expect to get some strings, I guess. And we just plug in a X, a Y, and a Z, tell them all their strings. And then that gives us these little nodes here once we compile. We then drag off of here, we convert to a float, we put it into a make vector, which then goes into the new location for the set actor location, and then we just tell it to teleport us there. You can also tell it to sweep, which I guess triggers like overlap stuff. So maybe if you have like aggro zones between where you are and where you want to go, you'll aggro half the world as you teleport or something. But yeah, this is our loading here. So you can't really test the loading right now because you don't have data for it probably. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at the saving, and then we can just combine these two. So this right here is our save logic, and this right here is our load logic. And I'm doing a, what is it, like a C. I just press C on my keyboard to create those comments. And then we can save these as like, I don't know, blue for loading, and maybe we'll go with green for saving, right? Okay, so now let's take this, move it over here. We can zoom in. So if we press 2, we then want to save our object. In that case, we have to call or we have to get the actor transform. We then have to call this function here, which is make player JSON object. There's probably a cleaner way to do this, but I couldn't for the life of me figure it out because I'm a complete noob when it comes to Unreal Engine. So if we come in here, this is just a separate function that takes in the X, the Y, and the Z, and then it puts it into this absolutely atrocious append where I'm manually building out the player object, which I guarantee someone in the comments is going to go, hey, there's a thing for this. But I just couldn't figure it out in like the 30 minutes I have to make these videos every day. So what we do is we construct this similar to what a Postman request needs to look like, which I hopefully have here somewhere. Okay, so this is what we expect from a Postman request. Full screen this maybe. We get, or we pass in a body that has a player X, a player Y, and a player Z. Let me actually grab the body here, the raw body. There we go. Okay, so we pass in something that looks like this. Inside of braces, we have to give it the required parameter. So we have an object that has the required parameter inside of it. Remember, that's coming from our Rails controller. If we go over to the player's controller, we are requiring a player, which means we need to have that required thing right here. And then everything after it that we're permitting needs to be inside of these braces after the required object that's inside of these outer braces. So we have to construct something similar to this in our Unreal Engine. So what we do is we create these. Let me move this over to the side, and then maybe we can move Unreal over here. We create the same setup here where we have this, this outer brace. We then have the player in quotation marks with the colon. We then have the brace. We then pass in the X, and then we actually grab the X value from our input here. We then have, after the X, a comma, the Y colon, then the Y variable, then a comma, the Z, then comma, blah, 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 blah. And then we use our two closing braces here. So we have M total here for the setup, and that creates a object that looks like this in string form. That then gets put into the return node here, and the return node is piped out of this function. If you're wondering how this actually works, you can pretty much, just make this right here by copying it, come over here, paste it in. You drag these over like this, and then you can highlight this, both of these, right click, and you want to collapse to function, and that's how you make one of these functions. So that gives you that. You then need to click on the output to give it a JSON output, or whatever you want to call it, and then you change the type here to a string. Oops, change it to a string. There we go. And now you have the exact same setup here for your function. If you want to rename it, you can come over here and just click rename on this, or just press F2. And if you're not familiar, F2 is like the universal rename hotkey. So if you ever want to rename something, that's how you can do it. But okay, now we have this function. We grab it, we log the string just for debugging purposes. We then come over here and we call make JSON with it. And then we take this, we tell it that this has the data name, and it's of type string. So if you'll recall, inside of our Rails controller here, we are parsing out the data. So that's where this data is coming from, is just we create this object here and we name it data. I couldn't really find a cleaner way to convert this monstrosity into a VA REST JSON object without doing this. And I just named it data for the sake of like consistency, right? So once we have that, we then have the save URL, which goes to local, or it goes to our IP port 3000/save location, which is that controller route we created earlier inside of our config routes RB. That is our save location action here, which is a post. That's important. Remember that the saving has to be a post verb of type JSON, and the loading has to be a get verb of type JSON as well. So once we do that, we put that in there. We then get a callback again. And then for our response, we get the response content as string. And then we log the string here because we're not really doing anything after the response, right? We've saved our location, but then we're done, right? Maybe we want to quit the application after we save or whatever, or exit the save menu. So when we do all of that, we put it all together. We get something that looks a little bit like this. So if we press play, come down to our output log, which you can access by going to your window output log if you don't have it. And then in our output log, whenever we do something, we'll see it logged here. So if we press 1, that's our load command. And you can see here, if I press F8, I can move my mouse again. Well, maybe you can't, but basically it takes the JSON, it prints it to the screen here, which tells me this is my ID of 1, a X of -847, a Y of 573, and a Z of 67. It gives me the created at and the updated at because this is coming from the backend. Because if we press 1, remember, that is our load logic. So 1 loads it, and then it prints the response to the output log. We then, down here, we get it in a bit of a neater format, but it's the same thing. Now, if we press F8 again to reposition or snap onto our player, we can then press 2 to do a save. And when we do the save, we can press F8 again. Down here, we can see that this gets sent to the backend. And if we open up our terminal actually with our Docker container, we can hopefully see, let me actually just clear this. I'll hit F11 and we'll come in here and we'll just do another 2 to save, and I'll hit F8 again. Now if we come in here, we should hopefully see this right here. So it says started post to /save_location/1. And then right here, it tells us it's processing by the player controller, save location. It then has the parameters, and this is where we get that data parameter, which has the player inside of it. And this is all in string format, which is super fun and definitely not frustrating to figure out how to work with the first time you run into it. And then you have your ID and your player here, which is empty. But once you get this, you can then parse out that weird string by doing the, where is it? By doing the json.parse. And then once you get those params, you can call action controller parameters.new for the data, and then only require and permit the things you want so that it's safe and sanitized. You can, of course, also call your accepts if you want to make sure that you're only grabbing what you need to. But yeah. So anyways, this is just a basic, pretty hacked together implementation that I have here. I just thought it was neat and interesting to try and do this with Rails. And I figured that the getting of data was interesting, but saving and loading a player location is probably far more interesting than anything else. So yeah, hopefully this was interesting. Hopefully it was helpful for like the one person out there that needs to do this for some reason. And hopefully I will see you in the next video.